There is a thrilling past in England's long history. On the beaches of southern England, a group of Viking mercenaries from Denmark quietly landed, greeted by John of England. Since the death of Lionheart Richard in 1199, his brother John succeeded to the throne. During his 16-year reign, John not only lost much of England's territory but also relentlessly amassed wealth post-war. He even used his royal power to have affairs with the wives of many nobles. Unable to bear it any longer, the nobles were forced to rebel against King John's rule. This bloody civil war lasted for over 3 years, culminating in the famous Barons' War. Thus, in 1215, to grant freedoms to the common people and constrain royal power, the nobles coerced King John into signing the Magna Carta. However, a mere document could not suppress John's ambitions. To restore his former life of indulgence and absolute power, he summoned a group of Viking mercenaries to help him seize control.
His Eminence is waiting to hear you. Hold to yours. The Church will stay out of your lands. You have his word.
We'll get your country back.
On a rainy day, Father Abbot brought the Knights of the Holy Order to Baron Darnay's city-state to shelter from the storm. Darnay immediately recognized the identity of the Knights Templar and even mentioned that they were enemies of the king. However, Darnay did not ask them to leave immediately but allowed them to depart early the next morning. The next day, Marshal went to the city wall and saw the king's army approaching.
John.
He informed Abbot, and they hid in the attic to observe the situation outside. King John had already entered the city. He asked his men to control Baron Darnay, because Darnay was also the one who forced him to sign the treaty. Frightened, Darnay told John that the paladin was hiding in the city. At that moment, Abbot approached and claimed he was merely seeking refuge from the storm. John had no intention of letting him go. He wanted all who had once opposed him to perish. Seeing John's brutality, Marshal stepped forward. During the massacre, Knight Marshal escaped with Abbot, but Abbot ultimately died. Marshal then rushed to the holy city of Canterbury to inform the Archbishop of John's tearing up of the charter and his assault on the nobles. The knight's name was Thomas Marshal, a legendary figure from the Crusades who had laid down his sword, weary of killing, yet he found himself embroiled in this conflict. The Archbishop planned to join forces with Prince Louis of France to block John's army at Rochester Castle. Rochester, a strategic stronghold in southern England, was crucial. Whoever controlled the castle would hold an unassailable position. Thomas, along with William and others, rode swiftly to the castle. Although there were only 7 of them, they were still very eager to fight. After a night of hard riding, they reached Rochester Castle. Upon entering the Great Hall, they found 6 Vikings reveling. It turned out that John, having received the news, had already sent men to guard the place. After dealing with the Viking mercenaries, Thomas immediately checked the positions of the sentries and the water supply. At this time, there were fewer than 20 able-bodied defenders in the city, despite the advantageous terrain. However, the moat in front of the city gate had long since dried up. Thomas furrowed his brow, knowing this would be a tough battle. Unbeknownst to him, he had caught the eye of the city lord's wife, Isabel. The city lord cared little for her. Their marriage was merely for land and wealth. The next day, John finally reached the outskirts of Rochester Castle. With a command from the Viking leader, the catapults launched a fierce assault on the city. In an instant, massive stones rained down like meteors, crushing any sentries who couldn't escape. John was ecstatic and immediately ordered the archers to fire their arrows. A hail of arrows descended on the city, further decimating the already wounded defenders. The Viking mercenaries then launched their assault, their momentum unstoppable. Witnessing this, Thomas was shocked and ordered a counterattack as soon as the enemy's siege ladders came within range. But with only a handful of defenders on the walls, they were no match for the thousands of attackers. The Viking mercenaries quickly scaled the walls, and a fierce battle ensued. Thomas took the lead and killed an enemy soldier with one sword strike. Although the defenders were small in number, they worked well together. Despite their losses, Thomas and his men successfully repelled the Viking mercenaries. With no other option, John ordered a retreat. After the initial assault failed, he commanded his army to gather materials and build siege towers. Thomas and his men felt the pressure, but they did not give up. An old soldier, looking at the crossbeam of a horse, suddenly had an idea. Working together, they quickly constructed a makeshift catapult. Once the siege towers were completed, the Vikings launched another attack to the sound of charging horns. Thomas and his men repeated their old tricks, using the high ground to shoot arrows and kill the enemy. Suddenly, 2 oil jars struck the castle interior precisely, and the siege tower advanced toward the castle under the cover of the catapult. Watching from the rear, John was thrilled, knowing that once the tower reached the walls, the Vikings could pour in. However, the defenders' catapult was ready. As the siege tower came within range, the catapult fired precisely, setting the tower ablaze with its explosives. Before John could react, the tower collapsed under the relentless barrage. The vanguard was wiped out, and John's army retreated once more. Furious, John had no choice but to end the second assault. After this battle, John changed his strategy. He surrounded Rochester Castle on all sides, cutting off all supplies. The city's food was quickly consumed, and the defenders were forced to slaughter their horses for food. Months later, only Thomas's horse remained, but a Templar's horse could only die in battle, and the others feared Thomas's strength, so they dared not approach. Starving, they resorted to eating insects. The defenders' morale was slowly crumbling. Thomas knelt before a statue, praying fervently for a miracle, but all he received was his own helpless sigh. Looking at Isabel, who loves him, and remembering the oath he took when he joined the Knights Templar, Thomas decides to break his own commandments in order to survive. Under Isabel's watchful eye, he snuck through a secret passage and stole 2 bags of food from John's camp under the cover of night.
It's Thomas! Open the gates! Beckett! Get him! Get him, Beckett! Come on! Quickly! The sacks! Come on! Hurry! Move it! Come on! Run! They're coming! Close the full cannon!
Seeing the abundant food, the defenders rejoiced, finally able to eat their fill. After the meal, Thomas went to the stable to clean his sword, where Isabel had been waiting. Looking at the woman before him, Thomas finally gave in. The next morning, a guard, puzzled by the empty landscape outside the city, looked down and saw the blind spot filled with Viking soldiers. He sounded the alarm, but it was too late. A horde of Vikings swarmed the walls. After 2 major battles, only 9 defenders remained. Outnumbered, William was the first to be struck in the neck and fell from the wall. Thomas, his strength waning, was overwhelmed by a group of Vikings and knocked to the ground. The Vikings then forced open the city gate, allowing John's army to pour in. Everyone inside grabbed weapons and fought to the death. Thomas, regaining consciousness, charged at the enemy. He defeated a dozen soldiers, but the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. Eventually, he was pulled from his horse. In a desperate moment, his horse dragged him to safety. With no other choice, the survivors retreated to the fortress. William, who had fallen from the wall, was not dead. As the leader who forced him to sign the Magna Carta, John directly ordered William's hands to be chopped off as a warning to others. News arrived that the French army was approaching the castle. John didn't have much time left, so he ordered the Vikings to drive a group of pigs to the foundation of the castle. As the firewood was ignited, the flames mixed with lard, and a heat wave suddenly hit, and thick smoke filled the entire fortress through the cracks. Not long after, the impregnable castle began to collapse. Viking soldiers poured in through the breaches, and despite their valor, the defenders could not hold out against the onslaught. Fortunately, Thomas was strong enough to engage the Viking leader in combat. Both wounded from the previous fight, the Viking leader saw the French reinforcements approaching and grew desperate to defeat Thomas. Thomas found an opportunity to stab him to death. The arrival of the archbishop and the French reinforcements also drove the Vikings away. Thomas rode out of the castle on his horse, and the archbishop granted him his freedom. No longer a Templar bound by his vows, Thomas left with his beloved Isabel. John, fleeing, contracted dysentery and died.